Welcome to Coffee with Kelly. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kelly Moore, School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. In each episode, we've been exploring key topics and strategies to ensure effective communication during crises and emergencies. In today's episode, we'll delve into the crucial role of communication with parents in maintaining school safety. We'll also cover the steps schools need to take to ensure that they are communicating properly with their parents, as they are the most important stakeholders. Join us now as we go deeper into the world of school safety. Well, good morning, Kelly. Mr. Kelly Moore. How are you doing today?
I'm well. It's good. Good day. Good morning. Things are good at the Moore household.
Anything exciting happen over the weekend?
I am a grandfather for the third time. Officially the third time.
That's very cool.
I have 3 biological grandkids and a step grandchild that we consider our own.
Nice. Yeah. Now, are you one of these grandfathers that just like spoils your grandchild?
Nope.
No?
Nope. That's what they have a grandmother for.
Oh, okay.
Of course, I interact with them quite a bit, but I'm more of a disciplinarian type.
Okay.
Stay within I'm not a spoil them and send them back to their parents kind of guy. I kind of want them to keep the decorum.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I have to interject here because my grandfather, who's passed away now, but he when I was much younger, I would go up to him and bother him. He'd be sitting in his chair, and I'd go up and bother him, and he would take my hands and he would pinch my fingers until I screamed. But I kept coming back for whatever reason, and eventually he softened up.
Because you kept coming back. He knew you could take it.
Yep.
Yeah. You wore him down.
I did.
Nice. What are we talking about today?
Well, so, over the course of all these podcasts, we've been, overall talking about communication. So today we're going to go into that a little bit deeper, and we're going to talk about kind of the varying roles of stakeholders in that communication process. So why don't you kind of more of a high level, what's the starting point there?
The starting point is, I'm going to ask you a question. I think you know the answer to this.
Okay. Hopefully I do.
As we get started, we've talked about communications a lot. And I'm wondering if people understand what the most identified corrective action that is needed during an after-action review of an incident. Whether it's a drill, whether it's an actual incident, whether it's an exercise, tabletop. What do you think the number one corrective action that they identify as being needed?
I'm going to go with communication.
You're correct. Isn't that strange? The number one most important thing we do in response to an emergency, and just in general in life, right, is communicate. Our ability to communicate what we want, how we want it, what needs to be done, by whom, those types of things. Yet almost I can't think of one time that I've done an after action review, and I'm talking many, many of them, that communication wasn't brought up at the very top. They might not say, hey, we need to communicate, but they will say things like this. I didn't know that. Why didn't you tell me that we needed to do that? I didn't know what the plan was. I didn't know the status of what we were doing. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you update me? Why didn't you, right? And that's all related to communications.
It's the lack of communication, and then communication isn't always just a verbal phone call or something. It could be as simple as an alert.
So this is a book that I like to recommend. It's all about leadership, and it's called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. I believe the spelling is Willnick. I believe that's it. Not 100% on that. But communications is such a big deal, especially in leadership. And if something goes wrong, it's always about the communication. And there's usually two things that occur that cause miscommunications between leadership and those that are being asked to accomplish objectives. And the first one is that you miscommunicated what it was that you wanted your troops to do. The second one is that you misunderstood what your leadership wanted you to do, so that you miscommunicated to your troops. You were very clear on what you wanted to communicate, but you didn't understand what your chain of command wanted. So looking at the communications issue, it's really interesting that we all identify communications as the most important thing, but it's also the most talked about issue that we have during an incident. So we have to work through that. So when we start talking about that, and we start looking at school safety specifically, there are so many pieces to this puzzle, and we've talked about many of them, if not most of them, from a high level, categorically speaking. We've talked about all of these different pieces, but we haven't really talked about the communication aspect of that. And what we're really talking about is, how do we communicate with all of our stakeholders? There's many of them. As an example of a few of them, we have our students and staff. We have our administrators, our district administrators, our school boards, right? We have first responders. We have the fire department and law enforcement, both first responders, but we talk to them differently for different reasons, and we'll go into that a little bit. But we also have other partners, hospitals, mental health professionals, county and state emergency management agencies, those types of partners. Sometimes it's church groups or other organizations like that, because they have facilities that we need or we would like to have access to during an emergency, for like reunification, that kind of thing. And I'm going to mention this now, but we're going to go into this a little bit more in depth at the second half of this: your parents and families. Oftentimes we look at what we do in this sort of bubble, and we forget about how we communicate emergency, school safety, emergency response instructions, what we're doing, how we do that to the parents. That's usually an afterthought. And we'll go into the problems that creates.
So we talk about what is the need to communicate with those kind of higher level stakeholders, so the fire, police, other community members.
A good emergency plan, a good safety plan, one of the components that should be there, and I'm not sure that we've talked about this really, is a formalized communications plan. Who's responsible for the communication during our 4 stages of an emergency: our preparation, our prevention mitigation, our response, our recovery phases. Each one of those has unique communication needs and requirements. Who's responsible for that? Is that a district level thing? Is that a school level? And if it's a district level, who is it? The public information officer? Sometimes they're called the director of communications, however you word that in your area or your district. Is it the superintendent? Is it the principal? Is it a board member? Those identifying who's responsible for that during what phases. And if you have a large scale emergency, that role may change because of the impact on the school or schools may be such that the person who's normally does that type of communication isn't available because it might be the principal or an assistant principal who is too busy or too involved or just not available. So how do you transfer that to the public information officer or the communications director? How do you do that? When do you do that? How do you set up what's being said? How do you do that in an emergency? Do you have templates? Does somebody write it down real quick? I'm suggesting you have templates that at least get you started so you can put something out real quick, even if it's something as simple as we're having insert the type of emergency at which school. We understand your concern. We're addressing the issues as best we can. We have law enforcement en route. We will update you as soon as we have more information. Send that out. Who do you send that to? Do you send that out to the other schools? How about other districts in your area? The districts that neighbor you? Parents? Organizations? Law enforcement? Who knows, right? But have those plans taken care of beforehand. Think through that. I always included, if they were available, the district's public information officer so that they could see the process, because you have to understand that they're not necessarily emergency public information officers. They're communications people. They're PR people, right? But during an emergency, guess who's going to be requested to communicate to the public, the media, that kind of thing?
Can too much, if I'm a school or a district, can I communicate so much that it actually makes the situation at hand worse?
Yes. The restrictions should be understood that nobody can say anything that would cause complications or exacerbate the emergency. If you're strictly abiding by incident command, as soon as you identify an incident commander, the incident commander should have the approval authority as to what is said and when it is said to prevent that concern of putting out too much information, right? So there's oftentimes during, again, we're going to talk about active violence events because that seems to be in the forefront of people's minds.
Yeah.
The need to identify victims, right? This urgency, the number of injured, the number of fatalities. There's this need. The problem comes in is there's a conflict with most state laws or local laws and that need. So the conflict is this: law enforcement, who often is required, or the medical examiner is required to identify the cause, manner of death, but also to make a positive identification. And there's a legal standard for what that requires. And oftentimes that can't be done immediately. So asking for numbers of victims, how many fatalities, how many injured, is a pretty tough thing to do, especially initially. You might be able to say we transported 7 people, but their status is something that's very difficult to actually report. There's HIPAA laws. Everyone's heard about those. And just keeping track of what the actual, I guess, medical status of somebody is very, very difficult in a timely, real-time type environment. So yes, there are some things that you should be telling them, right? You should be telling them, we know that this is going on. please don't come here. We're going to give you instructions on where to go to get more information, whether it's a website or a location, but don't come to the school. We don't want you to interfere with what we're doing right now. We understand that concern, but we don't want you to interfere with what's going on. If you want to come close, we have a family gathering area at this spot, whether it's a park or a parking lot somewhere. That's where you need to go.
I would imagine that, if you're going through a relatively severe situation, that you'd have, parents obviously trying to get as much information on what's happening. And if the more people involved, the kind of more hectic that can be, while you're trying to, de-escalate the situation, having all this other extra input from that would probably not be very helpful.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon, right? So if I don't give you the information, you're going to go find it. And the only way for you to find it as a parent is the rumor mill through social media. And oftentimes that's absolutely incorrect information. Or maybe you feel like you need to go to the site. I'm going to give you it's kind of related to this, but not directly. I'm going to give you a Kelly story. We had a lockdown at a high school, and it was involved, and I've used this example recently, I think in one of the most recent podcasts, is we had an incident across the street from one of our high schools. A law enforcement agency from another jurisdiction was serving an arrest warrant of a murder suspect across the street in an apartment complex from our high school. They didn't communicate anything to us when they were doing it. I think that's been corrected since then, since I went and asked them not to do that again. But they ended up getting into a shootout with the suspect. So things went south pretty quick, right? And we locked the school down and we started working through that event. The district office was 7 or 8 miles away from this particular high school. But the urge from superintendents, assistant superintendents, the leadership of the district office felt the urge to converge on the school. We need to be there. We need to be at the school.
That's going to be my question, is why do you need to be there?
Right? I don't give them that opportunity.
Yep.
Right? You don't need to be there. This is still an ongoing situation. We don't need you there. But you don't understand, Kelly. I said, I do understand. I understand you don't need to be there. You can either wait there. You can come over to the command post if they'll let you around that way. And I'll get you into the command post, but you don't need to be onto the site. And there's lots of reasons that he shouldn't have been there. But that's the same urge that parents have. They want to be there. Their kids are there. In his mind, his kids were there. Right. The kids and his staff who he wants to protect and do everything he can to protect. He wants to be there. That's not the place for him. I understand the urge, but that's not the place for him. So let's communicate that. Let's have a plan on how we're going to do that. Let's train people on how we're going to do that. Understanding that that training and those plans, and you can look those up at the rems.gov, that school. It's the school emergency readiness website that gives you plans. They have a communications plan in there, and the ability to train that. And like all other aspects of safety, you have to train it every time so that they understand their role in the particular schools, the particular situation. So if you're going to have a a director of communications or a public information officer do your communications to the public and the parents and all of those stakeholders during an emergency. They need to know exactly how they're going to do it, and they need to practice that just like everyone else. So I brought them in during our drills so they understood it. And oftentimes they, as part of our plan, I would call them and ask them to communicate something because we already got the approval from the incident command. And that's because as somebody who is well-versed in incident command, I asked the incident commander very quickly, hey, unless you want parents here, you better let me communicate with them. This is what I'm going to tell them. And I got the approval, and the incident commander didn't need to see the actual body of the communication, the email, the texts, those types of things, because it was already approved. And we can do that very quickly, especially if we're training, especially if we're bringing in our incident command people to our drills, those types of things.
And that whole process would go a lot smoother if, you had a drill of that. You had roles established already. You already had a template. You get to that situation, the less questions that I feel like you have to ask, the better. Of who's responsible for this? What are we doing here? Like, if you already know the answers to that beforehand, it's going to make, dealing with that situation a lot smoother. Right.
Number one most important thing is communications.
Yep.
Number one thing that is identified as a problem is communications. And yet most of our plans don't include a communications plan. I was lucky when I was at the sheriff's department. I had a very, very good, actually a couple of very good PIOs, public information officers. And they both came from backgrounds that weren't law enforcement. But they knew what they didn't know. So when we were talking about things, we'd always talk about, what do you want me to do here, Kelly? What do you want? Even though they didn't work for me, they worked for the sheriff so they worked directly for him. But oftentimes I was the incident commander, or I was involved in the incident command to a point where they felt like, okay, who's going to know the answer to this question? And they could come to me, or we could talk about it long before any incident. Because of our location in Southern California, we often started talking quite a bit during fire season, flood season, those types of things. So we got that going to the point where the last PIO I worked with, she organized a group of public information officers from around the area so that we got those questions and things answered. We did it as a group. We had a plan.
So you've been talking about having a communication plan, and you kind of touched on, the things that you would need to be able to provide, let's say a PR representative or whatever the case may be. Let's maybe transition into, specifically what are some of the things or ways that we can, as a school, communicate to parents so that they can feel that they can feel that sense of trust. They can, any way that we can alleviate any anxieties, basically.
Yep. So there's the obvious channels that you can do it, but oftentimes it's the manner in which you communicate, right? Or when you communicate. So these are the technologies that are available. Mass notifications, emails, group, or entire school, SMS, text messages. You can send home flyers. You can call specific people. You can have robocalls saying, this is what's happening today at school. You can have all of that stuff. None of it is good if you don't practice it and you don't have the communications plan itself. Now, there's times that you need to communicate. And so we talked about it, and we've talked about it, and we've talked about it. So we're going to talk about it again. Is especially with your directly involved partners and those people who are there to support you and help you and respond to your emergency. So we're talking the students and staff, right? They need to know what to do. They need to know under what circumstances they're going to communicate. They need to know how they can communicate with you during an emergency. Do you have an app? Do you have a manner, some way that they can give you information where they can identify that they need help and what type of help they need? Can you check on them at any given time? They need to understand that. They need to understand if I have information about what's happening, I can send that, I can communicate that somehow with the incident command team. Two-way communications. Communicating with your students just to let them know what's going on, what the protocols are, what the expectations are of them and their behavior, and what they can do to help move this emergency along quicker than they might think, right? The ability to communicate with first responders, obviously, is a huge thing. That's why it's so important that that partnership is developed, nurtured, maintained long before anything happens. Because here's the fact of the matter. If you don't do that beforehand, everything is going to be delayed because you're going to try to figure it out on the fly. Or this is what's going to happen. They're going to, and I say law enforcement, fire, medical, they're just going to come in, take control, and do everything without your consent or knowledge or understanding of what they're doing. And there's many reasons you don't want that to happen. A lot of people think, I'm going to press that. We've talked about this before. I'm going to press that big red button and just wait for them to come handle this emergency. There are so many reasons why that's not the best way to handle this, that it's too long, too many for us to really discuss, especially in this podcast, but in a single podcast. So then we start looking at our partners and understanding what the expectations. How do we communicate that we need the church next door for reunification? How do we do that? Right. And I'm going to transition into probably, I know that if I ask a school, they will, and I ask who's your most important stakeholder, they're going to say our families, our students and parents. If you were to ask your parents that, they might not say that. If you were to ask your parents and your families, do you believe that you are at the top priority in the communication circle of this, whatever the school does? Do you think you're on their first speed dial? You're the number one speed dial as parents of the school? They're going to say no, probably. I don't know why that is. We should communicate with those people so often that they get sick of us. We should be telling them everything. We should tell them what to expect.
Is there really a parent out there that would get sick of hearing, updated information about their kid?
Yeah, there is, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't, but
right. But there's, and this is just part of life and society. And so There are parents and families that drop their kids off, and the schools will tell you this. I'm not making this up. And there's little involvement from the parents. The parents essentially want them to raise their kids. And that's become such a thing that, the schools have taken that role on as being the caregivers of their students in many, many cases. But that doesn't mean that the parents don't care or aren't involved in some way. And we've talked about this part from other aspects of emergency response and notifications and so forth. And this is Kelly's theory on society in regards to emergencies and preparations and so forth. Many, many people, I'm going to say a majority, and I would venture to say a very good majority of people out there don't consider emergencies much at all. And I phrase it this way. People generally think of it like this. It's not a problem until it's a problem. I don't care. It's not happening to me right now. It'll never happen to me. And, I'm going to go about my day. I'm not going to think about preparation. I'm not going to think about situational awareness. I'm not going to think about prevention of this stuff. That's somebody else's job. I'm not going to do it until they need to. And then all of a sudden they're surprised. We hear this all of the time. Well, we had another unthinkable event at this school, another mass shooting at this school. The unthinkable happened. Really? You're going to use that terminology? This was unthinkable? I think we wrote a whole blog on the unthinkable, rethinking the unthinkable. Because, again, we're 24 plus years away from Columbine. We know that this could happen anywhere. We just don't know where. So this isn't an unthinkable event. But we see it over and over again. And there's a converse to that, or an obverse, I don't know what the correct term is, another version of that, is that it ceases being a problem as soon as it ceases being a problem, which means they revert back to their previous behavior. They don't learn from it. And I think we were talking just the other day about this just in conversation. I was part of the Unified Command in a very large flood in 2018 in Southern California that killed 23 people. During that event, it was a debris flow. What triggered it was we had about 7 or 8 inches of rain in 15 minutes.
That's insane. In
a burn scar. And that fire was actually still going when we had that rain. And so we had this fresh burn area, and then we had this just deluge of rain in a very short period of time. We tracked that storm for days before this happened. We were on the news. We had press conferences in all of the areas. We had town hall meetings. Hey, here's your danger. Here's what you need to do. You need to sign up for alerts. You need to do this. At the time of that event, if I remember the numbers correctly, we had about 20% of the population that were signed up for the emergency alerts. As soon as it stabilized after that event was triggered, we had upwards of 60 to 70%, if I remember correctly. A few weeks down the road, we evacuated that area 5 or 6, maybe 7 times. It was a lot because of additional rain storms that were coming. And we thought there was an additional hazard. And so we evacuated an awful lot. When we stopped evacuating them, because we started getting into the spring and, quote, drier months in California, we stopped evacuating. People unsubscribed to the notification service. So we went back down a little bit higher than the pre-event, but very close to that pre-event, those numbers, because it was no longer a problem for them.
That's just wild.
Right? Couldn't understand it. But that's what we're talking about.
And it's not like they were getting constant, marketing emails from you guys
right
after the fact.
Nope. They're getting alerts. That's the sole purpose of that. We have this alert, this warning, this weather situation. You would get if there was police activity in your area because they could geofence the alert areas. People only in this area get it. That kind of stuff, right? So, yeah, it was only for information, emergency type information that you needed to know. So, and oftentimes parents are that way, but we need to be proactive as school safety officials, especially with emergency information and emergency drills and things like that. We need to be very proactive, assertive, borderline aggressive with that stuff, keeping it in the forefront of everyone's minds. And for no other reason than to say, I tried. And let me make this point real quick. There is a difference between the channels in which you communicate on when you're talking about everyday communication versus emergency communications. You have to be able to differentiate between the two, and the emergency communications should be isolated to only that type of information. So when something comes across on that channel, you know right away, this is not a permission slip, or this is not a request for you to pay for your kids' overdue library book, or you have a cafeteria bill due, or whatever, right?
So as an example, what you're saying is like, those cafeteria bills, those other, minor notifications might be something you'd put like in an email, but then the more, dire need kind of alerts would be more of like a push notification or something like that.
Right. So there's the way that they receive the alert has to be different. So there's a lot of services out there that do this on a regular basis. When I was in school, they didn't have this stuff. They didn't even have cell phones.
Yeah.
So
that was a long time ago.
Not that long ago when you think about it. But they used to give you a bulletin to take home to your parents. Here's all the information you need to know. And it was done with my kids. It was done. They called it the Thursday folder. So each kid had their own folder that parents would expect that home every Thursday. They would look through it, and then they had to sign the Thursday folder that they read it. And then the child would return on Friday with their Thursday folder signed, right? So that was back then. Today, it's all electronic, emails, text messages, that kind of stuff, but it's still the same information. And you still get people who don't read it because they get fatigued. What is this? What is that? And they don't respond. I get it. But you don't want your emergency communications going in that same channel. You don't want it delivered the same way, because you don't want it to get lost or buried.
That makes sense.
Right? So they should be on two separate channels, two separate mechanisms, so that when that goes off, you go, oh, this isn't a permission slip request. This is something's happening. I need to know, and I need to pay attention to this. Right? So understand that. The next thing that you have to understand is, what is that communication, and when, and how fast, and so forth.
All right. You've talked about from the perspective of, what the school needs to do and how to do it in terms of communication. Now, there's another part to this. The communication goes both ways. So let's talk about
Mm-hmm.
the role of a parent or a guardian. What does that look like?
From my perspective, a lot different than it actually does now. We see a lot of communications from the media. We see a lot of communications from our own schools and so forth. The way we communicate can either impart confidence or lack of confidence. And we've had conversations with parents. I've had lots of conversations with parents. In fact, one of the primary reasons I was hired by the school district as a school safety coordinator, it was not given to me as part of the hiring, but it was one of my first assignments. So, it was top of priority, was to communicate with a parent group who were upset about the way a high school handled an incident. It was probably handled correctly from as far as I could tell with the little information I had available to me. But that incident got that principal fired / demoted back to a teacher he was a high school principal and ended up being a teacher at some other middle school or something like that. And then eventually they fired him. But the whole incident was around communications. And I think most people will at least philosophically agree with me that parents drive safety in the schools. Parents drive a lot of things that are in the schools. In fact, some parent groups are so powerful that they actually drive state law in how schools treat parents, how schools are structured, and so forth. But we need that same sort of organization and concern and assertiveness where the parents are now talking about, what are you doing to keep my kids safe? And the school can't just show a 3-inch binder of paper that says, this is my safety plan. We do everything in here and we cover everything as required by law. Oh, really? What would you do if this happened? How are you doing give me an example of how you handle bullying, assaults in the prevention, right? We talked about bullying being one of the number one reasons for grievance that active shooters have, that they don't fit into their school. What are you doing to keep these kids engaged and feel like they fit into the school? What are you doing? Because we know that's if kids feel like they belong and you address bullying behavior at an early age, they're likely not, you can't guarantee it, but they're likely not to become a shooter at the other side of the spectrum, right? So we need to challenge that. We need to ask, what are you doing? How would you handle this? And are you actually handling it that way? Right? So we need to have that sort of conversation with our parents. And I think our schools should be actively reaching out to parents to say, hey, we're having a town hall meeting. We're going to have these people and we're going to talk school safety. We're going to have this panel up there. I participated one in St. Louis, Missouri. We had mental health professionals, both internal to the school and external to the community. We had law enforcement. I was sat on that because I bring a different perspective. So I sat on that and that was a very good conversation. I had 100 or so family members there. It was a great event. But if you're listening to this podcast and your school's not doing that, somebody needs to make some noise. Let's do that. Let's have that conversation. Go to the PTA or PTO or whatever you call it in your area, and let's talk about that. And let's start bringing that to the surface so that everyone can be confident that the school is doing everything they can to keep my kids safe. That's a challenge, right? Because I expect you to keep my kid safe. My kid is my priority. Schools have a different priority. Still should be safety, but their priority is to keep everyone safe. So let's have that conversation and understand the perspectives.
And you'd probably say that just kind of what we were talking about before, that it's, a lot of people see It's not a problem until it becomes a problem. So if you're a parent, don't wait until your kid gets bullied to go and have those conversations.
Don't wait till it's a problem. Let's
Yeah.
try to get a plan going before it becomes a problem. If your kid is being bullied, address that quickly. Understand how to address that.
Yep.
Right? So address that quickly and be relentless. Because I always say this, the school might not like you doing that. I don't care that they don't like that. I think you should be doing that. And I think your efforts in keeping your school or your kids safe has an impact on keeping everyone else safe. And it's absolutely 100%, no denying it. It is worth every effort you make, even if the school doesn't like it. Make them uncomfortable. Make them bring law enforcement. Make them do drills. Make them do whatever. Make them do it. Because we're seeing a lot of schools that are saying it can't happen here. It wouldn't happen here. Right? Get that done. Now let's take one shift just a little bit away from the normal everyday school issues. And let's bring it into a very specific area, those with disabilities. Let's bring it there and have that conversation.
That's great.
Because every kid that has disabilities has a specific need. How do we address that? Do we just hope that they're doing that? Do we have an IEP? Do we have a 504 plan? When do we talk about my kid's safety? When do we talk about what my kid needs to get out of a building in an emergency? Can you move my kid in an emergency? Some kids literally cannot be moved because of severe disabilities.
Yeah.
They can't be moved. So what is the plan for that? If you have a child in a wheelchair and they're on the second floor and the elevator doesn't work, what is your answer? So in the emergency services business, we call that those with access and functional needs. They need extra help. Parents need to understand that the schools are doing everything they can, and the schools need to understand the specific needs of your child.
Now, in a communication plan, or in that emergency plan, would you list kind of generically those needs, or would you get really specific and put in student A, needs these things in this situation? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so good question. So frankly, this is what I did. I think it's a good solution. I think there has to be an individual safety plan, different than what you would consider under a threat and behavior management. There's safety plans put into there, but this is an individual safety plan, just like an individual education plan is specific to the child. So there's lots of things that HIPAA and can't be communicated. How I rescue your child is not one of those, right? So we already have a built-in system required by law to have periodic meetings with the school and the parents regarding the IEP, the individual education plan for those with disabilities. 504s for accommodations. That's already built in. Why not take 5 or 10 minutes of that time to talk about the individual safety of your child? What are they going to do in an emergency? If they can't be moved, how do we protect them? Who's going to protect them? Where is that going to occur? Those types of things. How do we communicate with the person who's the caretaker or staying with them? What are their duties and functions, responsibilities, expectations, that kind of things, right? Do that periodically. Whether it's every year, every 2 months, whatever that interval is. I actually had a kid with an IEP, but I forget what the interval was because it's been more than 2 weeks ago. But it happens.
Yeah.
So have that conversation. And also, the school should consider this. So they have an obligation under the Individuals with Disabilities and Equality of Education Act, or it's called IDEA, and ADA, to treat those kids, give them the same rights and abilities to survive an emergency as every other kid, right? But we also have to consider some staff may have disabilities. So we have to talk about that. And what we're talking about is blind, visually impaired, hearing impaired, mobility impaired. And then there's this one aspect that is very seldom discussed, but it's a reality, is during an emergency, normally able-bodied people who don't need that as a result of the emergency may now need that. Broken leg, an injury as the result of a shooting, those types of things. How do you get them out? And there's other instances where you have athletes who, as a result of playing or practicing their sport, get injured. You might not think that they need a plan, but now they're on crutches for the next 6 weeks. So now they become somebody who needs a plan. So maybe that coach or somebody reaches out and says, "Hey, I see you have a broken leg. Yeah, it's going to be 6-7 weeks, and then I have a rehab and stuff." So then, okay, so let's talk about your classes and what you need to do to get out of them in case of an emergency and you need to be evacuated. Let's talk about that, right?
That's a great point. I wasn't even thinking about that. So that's very interesting. So that's almost where I would think that those more, generic plans might come into play.
Maybe, but this is, so I also required, the office staff, principal specifically, to keep a registry of everyone who needed specific help, assistance. They had this individual safety plan, and you could attach that safety plan to the spreadsheet. We did it on a spreadsheet. It was pretty simple. You could attach that to the child's name. And I also wanted to know generally, it's very difficult to know specifically, but generally where they were going to be throughout the day. So as you know, elementary school, generally they walk into class at 8:30 in the morning and they leave at 2:30 in the afternoon, and they haven't left that class other than to go out to recess and lunch, library, that type of stuff. But generally speaking, they're in that class the entire day. When you start getting into, I just thought of something. You probably don't know this because you were homeschooled. But when you get into middle school and high school, there's 6 or 7 periods. So every hour, every 45 minutes, whatever that interval is, you're changing locations. So maybe have a class schedule available for each of those kids that you have this individual safety plan developed so that you not only know what it is, but where you might have to go to get them.
So if I'm thinking about this from, if I was a parent and a school came to me and said, "Hey, we have this individualized, customized safety plan for your kid or kids," that right there is going to tell me how much they care about my kid. And I'm going to have way more trust for a school if they have that, more than just either nothing or a generic plan. Because like what we've been talking about, each kid is different, and each kid's going to require something different in different events.
Yeah, agree. I'm going to correct you on one thing. they shouldn't come to you with a plan, and that should be a surprise for you
Yeah.
and build confidence. You should have participated in that plan.
Right. Yep.
So you should know about it. But the fact that they're going through that process accomplishes the same thing that you just indicated. Trust, confidence. Hey, we're doing this. We're making sure that we show you that we care about your child. And this is what we're going to do to make sure that they have the best possibility to survive this, at the same possibility as all of the other kids, right? But it does bring up a good point. Why do we care what the parents say? Why do we care that they know? Why do we care that we put through this effort? We're gonna treat them the same. Why do we care that they know or don't know?
Because parents are your biggest stakeholder, your biggest
right
decision maker, really.
Right. What else happens? Everyone sees, because of politics and reporting, everyone sees essentially every mass shooting at a school ever in the last 24 years. So do you think that type of coverage exudes confidence in our schools and that we're going to be able to send our kids to school every single day and bringing them home? My current boss, Jim Spicuzza at Crisis Go, said, really, Kelly, what is it that we're trying to do? What is the expectation of the parent? I said, here's very simple. I expect my kid to be able to get to school safely. Once they are safe at school, I expect my child to be in a safe, supportive, very robust learning environment. At the end of the day, I expect you to return my child in the same condition as they left.
Sounds fair to me.
Pretty simple expectations. But if all we're hearing about is shootings, and all we're hearing about is what's going on politically in the schools and all of that stuff, do you think that really just instills this confidence in the schools that you have my child in the best interest? Probably not. If they're thinking that way, that's causing anxiety, lack of confidence. Some parents are in this stage right now where we, as parents, are deciding which school should I send my child to. Many people don't have that choice, right? But many of them do. I can change schools within the district. I can send my kid to another school within the district if I don't have confidence in this one. I can send them to private school. I can homeschool them. I can teach them online. I can, we know that it's available. I mean, there's arguments how effective that was, but there's online schools, K through 12, right? I don't have to send my child to school. I have other options. And that affects your ability to teach all of these other schools. We've heard it in the news that there's a significant decline in enrollment in public schools. If there's a significant decline in enrollment in public schools, and it's significant enough that it's noticeable, what do you think that's affecting? I'll ask you that.
It is affecting the school budgets.
Mm-hmm. Many schools, their budgets are determined by ADA, average daily attendance, right?
Me being me, I've always thought it was the actual number of students, but it is so it's an average daily attendance.
The actual, they have to report that. That's why they have to take it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right? Is because their funding oftentimes is determined by the number of kids on an average basis that actually attend school. That's why they're so intent on truancy, you not showing up without an excuse, right? It used to be, I think we talked about this the other day as well. It used to be where when I was in school, we had a bunch of teacher and service days. Well, the schools started getting penalized for that because the kids weren't in school and they were losing a significant amount of money because of these teacher in service days. So they started manipulating that. We have late enrollment or late start times, early release days, right? And we have what we call minimum days. Well, those are all based upon the number of hours that a child has to be in school in order to be considered there for that day. Different places, but it affects that, right? To the point that they changed what they were doing. So there's a lot of anxiety right now, and parents are, and it's not just around school safety. It's around whether or not they have the ability to protect their child from other things. Allergies. Do you know what to do when your students, their child, comes with a peanut allergy? Very common. Can be very serious and become very serious very quickly if you don't address it and you don't know how to address it. And believe me, I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. There are parents who all have this in common. Their children have allergies, food allergies, and they have Facebook groups. They have support groups, because there's kids that have died because the school didn't account for their food allergy. Maybe they do 99.9% of the time, but that one time when the nurse is on vacation and leaves her office locked where the EpiPen is the time that you have that emergency. So if they're talking about this, they're losing faith and confidence in the school's ability to keep their child safe, not just in active shooters or fires or earthquakes, but on a day-to-day basis. Are you going to protect them from bullying or being bullied? Are you going to protect them from inappropriate relationships? Let's call it that. Sexual assaults, threats of sexual assaults. If you don't think that happens, give me a call and we'll talk about that, right? And online bullying and those types of things that sometimes we don't have a lot of control over, but we have to figure out how to. We have to instill in our parents the confidence that we are doing everything we possibly can. And we have to do that, because I am telling you, I've talked with people. I know Ethan has talked with people about this anxiety, and it's making them sick in many occasions, physically sick, emotionally sick, depressed, those types of things. And it's sad to see, because from my perspective, it's a lot of work, but it's not rocket science to keep our kids safe. We can do it, and we should be doing it. And we should be communicating what we want the teacher or the parents. We should be communicating that to them. We should encourage them. We should be assertive and aggressive in outreach. We are doing this to keep your kid's safety. We want your input. Come to this town meeting. We want to be able to talk to you about your concerns about school safety. Let's do it. It's not difficult. It takes some effort. I get it, but it's well worth it for everybody. I'll leave with this last. If kids feel safe, they have a much better opportunity to meet their potential. If a kid is afraid to go to school, or a parent is afraid to go to school, they have a much tougher time meeting their potential. Even those with very high potential can be affected by this safety. It's one of Maslow's primary needs, security and safety, right? And it's one of those things. If you're talking about your staff and to your staff, here's one of the things I don't understand. I know I said that last one was going to be the final, but it ain't. Our schools have this attitude, it can't happen here, or it won't happen here, or it's not a problem until it's a problem type attitude. But many of our educators just by demographics, are young, just starting out families, have kids in school, some of them in their school, some of them in other schools within their districts, some of them in other districts. But don't you want your colleagues to protect your kid? And you're in this industry. Don't you understand the potential there? If not, give me a call. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. But that need to protect those kids, do everything that you can for the mere sake that you want your colleagues to do that for your child. You're a parent. Get involved with the schools in making them safer. I totally understand the union issue with using personal cell phones. I get it. I don't agree with it, because putting stuff on your personal cell phone that could save a life of a child or your child, do it in a heartbeat. Yeah. You're already paying for the phone. Sure, it's work related. If you can get the school district to put that stuff on your phone, great. More power to you. But really, we're going to not do something like that because they didn't give us $5 a month or pay for our phone. When an event happens, you're likely going to wish that you had that capability, that technology available to you. Just a thought.
Well, that's all we have for today's episode. We hope you've paid attention to the steps needed in order to keep parents a top priority when it comes to communication. And parents, don't forget, your voice matters, so ask questions, be bold, and be a part of your children's safety. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we've discussed, please leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.